Okay, we're going to get going in just a minute. So. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of ITIF, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Accelerating Drone Innovation While Ensuring Public Safety. Before we begin, a few logistical notes. First, the event is being recorded and webcast. If you're joining us on the webcast, you're welcome to send questions. We'll have time for Q&A for everyone towards the end of the panel discussion. The hashtag we're using is ITIF drones, so if you send a question in using that hashtag, we'll be sure to ask it. The question we want to explore today is how can drones be safely integrated into the national airspace? 2 years ago, the FAA created rules for commercial use of drones, and these rules opened up new commercial opportunities. But of course, they had some limitations, particularly around restricting package delivery, restrictions on operating out of line of sight or flying at night, flying over individuals. Now, since these rules have been in place, there have been also a number of security incidents involving drones, including a crash last year involving a civilian drone and an Army helicopter. So as commercial drone usage increases, I think there's going to be growing pressure on law enforcement on how exactly they're going to respond to these types of threats. And right now, law enforcement agencies have limited capabilities to detect and respond to errant or malicious drones. The good news here is if we can figure out how to address this challenge, either through policy means or through technological measures, we can both improve public safety and accelerate the commercial adoption and integration of drones into the national airspace. So the conversation we're trying to have today on this panel is around how policymakers and industry can be working together to ensure safety, bolster U.S. competitiveness, and encourage commercial innovation in drone technology. So we have a really fantastic set of panelists here today for this event. First, starting on my left, is Lisa Ellman, a partner at Hogan Lovells and co-chair of its unmanned aircraft systems practice. She's also co-founder and co-leader of the Commercial Drone Alliance. Then we have Brendan Groves, counsel to the Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he leads the DOJ's efforts related to unmanned aircraft, and he chairs the Interagency Legal Working Group on countering UAS. We have Diana Marina Cooper, who's Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Precision Hawk. And then finally, at the far end, we have Ain Duong, who leads the DHS's Science and Technology Program Executive Office for Unmanned Aerial Systems, and also co-chairs the Working Group on Counter-UAS Technology with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So thanks again to all four of you for being here today. So I want to start by having a conversation about the current state of industry and the current state of capabilities. And so, Lisa, maybe we can start with you. Let's begin by talking about the innovation industry we've seen since the FAA rules have come into place. What kind of progress have we seen over the past couple of years, and where are we today?
Sure, Dan. Well, thank you first to ITIF. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. Lots of familiar faces and friends here today. The short answer is that we're in a really exciting state of commercial drone use. Over the last few years, what used to be considered toys of just hobbyists, which for decades hobbyists have been flying model aircraft, have turned into tools, important tools for the commercial industry and for all vertical market sectors, essentially. And it's very exciting that the uses are really limited only by our imagination. But the policy and the regs have kind of struggled to keep up with the technology. A few years ago, Part 107 went into effect for the first time ever, broadly authorizing commercial drone operations, and that was a big step forward. It only authorized low-risk operations, and really what the commercial drone industry is looking for is broad, expanded authorities in order to fly beyond visual line of sight, over people, at night, in order to really unleash the true safety and efficiency benefits of commercial drones. Then there's lots of numbers out there in terms of what the industry is going to look like over the next several years. PricewaterhouseCoopers, a recent report estimated the global market value of UAS-powered solutions at $127 billion. That's just one of many estimates out there. They're all big, however. The FAA itself has estimated that by 2020, there'd be 11 million commercial drones sold just here in the United States. So there's a ton of potential here, but there's also, a lot of while there is a lot of potential, we really need to be moving these expanded operations rules forward in order to unleash the true potential of the commercial drone industry.
Thanks. And Diana, I want to bring you in on this too. I mean, you're seeing it obviously directly from the vendor side. What kind of, what is the industry? How does it feel different today than it was 2 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there is an industry today where there really wasn't 2 years ago. Pre-107, it was a complex, lengthy process of one-on-one 333 applications, which were very limiting. There were also very restrictive requirements that actually just didn't really make sense for this industry, like holding an airman certificate in terms of a pilot license. So we've seen very positive change over the last year and a half in terms of very basic operations, so within line of sight, Class G airspace, and not flying over people. We've also seen great work done by the FAA and several companies, including us under Pathfinder, in order to pave the way for expanded operations. And we're starting to see some waivers come into effect for things like flight over people, beyond visual line of sight, and of course nighttime operations. And so we think that's very exciting, and we're sort of on the cusp of really seeing the true benefits that this technology can bring and the competitiveness that the United States faces here. And I think, one of the challenges has been the security issues that are really holding back the technology. And so we're very excited to be part of this discussion. And we're in general, very supportive of extending the authorities we're going to be talking about today.
Great, thanks. Brendan, let me bring you in on this. I mean, when we're talking about the public safety threats and risks associated with UAS, what do they look like today, and what are we kind of concerned about going forward?
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. So I think, in general, to step back, we see threats fall into two categories, broadly speaking. The first is terrorist activity, and the second is criminal activity. There are additional areas of concern, but to paint with a broad brush, let's just start there. On the first score, terrorist activity, we have watched with growing alarm over the last 2 years as ISIS perfected the art of weaponizing small, commercially available drones and turning what should have been engines of innovation into weapons of war. We are gravely concerned that the same tactic could be employed here. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, testified in public last fall to his concern that that threat could be, quote, coming here imminently. So the threat picture is concerning, and it has motivated a lot of focus and attention inside not only the federal government, I should say, but also our state and local counterparts. So that's the terrorism side of the picture. The criminal side of the house, we see an expansive and quite creative range of uses of drones to facilitate criminal activity. They are a means to criminal ends. They're not an end in themselves by any stretch, but they facilitate a wide range of criminal activity. This ranges from smuggling, smuggling drugs and contraband across the southern border, for instance, to surreptitiously delivering all manner of contraband inside state and federal prisons, to include cell phones, drugs, wire cutters. We've even seen some potential escapes from state prisons that may have been facilitated by the use of contraband dropped by drones. We also see illicit surveillance. More than that, in the future, we're concerned that drones make ideal hacking portals. So they allow you to get in close proximity to servers you thought were air-gapped. So overseas, a number of security researchers have showed us the vulnerabilities in place to computer infrastructure, and drones allow you to circumvent two-dimensional protections. They bring in the third dimension. So that, I think, paints an overall picture from the threats that we're seeing today.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about that's all kind of the malicious threat. What about the kind of the drone accidents, where it's unintentional types of circumstances. How do you think about that type of problem? And Brendan, let me start with you, but let me kind of open it up to the panel for anyone else how industry thinks about it as well.
Sure. So we do. I'll throw that into the errant category. Mm-hmm. So errant uses of drones are of concern, but not of primary concern for us. We're really worried about criminal and terrorist uses of drones. Infrastructure owners, including major sports stadium operators and owners, are quite concerned about errant uses. So not too long ago, a drone nearly hit a spectator in the head at a Padres game in San Diego. Drones have been used to drop leaflets over 2 NFL games in the Bay Area just last fall. So again, we would categorize those maybe as errant uses. The issue is, until it happens, you don't know if a use is criminal or errant. That's really the problem from the security side of the house. You don't know until after it happens. And that doesn't give security personnel any time to react. Doesn't matter whether you're a private security guard or an FBI agent. Your hands are tied. You have very limited time to react to these incidents.
Yeah. Lisa.
Yeah, and I would just in terms of errant, I think a lot of those policy issues kind of fall into the remote ID bucket, right? So we're talking about the criminal use of drones here with this legislation, but another important piece of that is being able to identify who the good guys and the bad guys, right? Identify the criminals, know who's just made a mistake by flying into restricted airspace, or who has bad intentions, or who's an authorized drone flight, inspecting that critical infrastructure facility or whatever it may be. And so, there was an ARC that came out with a set of recommendations. There was some, not necessarily, there wasn't a whole lot of agreement in terms of who should be covered around the remote ID ARC, but there is a lot of technology available now. And the ARC does a pretty good job describing a lot of that technology in terms of being able to efficiently and easily identify drones while they're flying. And that's another important piece of it that the commercial drone industry is very focused on, because of course from the commercial drone industry perspective, we support the spirit of the legislation, the devil's in the details. We want to make sure that we're protecting authorized commercial drone flights as well.
Mm-hmm. Diana, your thoughts on this?
Very similar to Lisa's points. I mean, we see counter-US measures as going hand in hand with remote ID and tracking, just so you have that awareness and you can take effective decisions in a timely manner. Long-term, remote ID and tracking, what we hope to see is that built out into a more fully fleshed UTM system that will actually provide the security and the safety in terms of airspace architecture that will truly give us, the safest and most secure airspace in the world that we're trying to protect here.
So what are, let's talk a little bit about kind of the countermeasures today for these threats. I mean, when you hear from a stadium owner, what are they able to do today? I mean, should people feel safe today, or is the threat really something that's coming down tomorrow where we don't have the capability?
So in terms of counter-UAS technologies, as you know, the market is full of solutions. There are a lot of commercial solutions out there, different types, right, from radars to EO, IR to acoustic to RF. So in general, there's a wealth of solutions. I would make 2 comments. One is a lot of those solutions were developed for military applications. So a lot of them have not been tested in homeland security settings, especially in urban cities or urban settings. So that's a gap that certainly the Department of Homeland Security is trying to close quickly, meaning we're trying to understand the state of the market, not even the state of the art, but the state of the market in terms of counter-UAS solutions that would be suitable for homeland security settings. So that's one part. The other part about solutions is, although there are a lot of solutions out there, not all solutions will be suitable for users because of the difference in terms of authority. Certain group of users, or feds versus state versus local versus private, like a sports stadium or whatever, they all have different, they're all subjected to not just federal laws but also state and local. So just because a solution exists in the market doesn't mean that all users can access or could use them. So that's another point that the feds always try to put out to make sure that users out there, especially those who are in the private sector, understand that solutions is one thing, but whether you could use them or not is a different story.
It's a great
I think
point.
that there's a related challenge, in terms of the legislation that's in place that's really preventing us from effectively even testing these technologies. And I think that's, created an unfortunate situation that really prevents, agencies like DHS, DOJ, and others to truly understand how it will operate in small UAV airspace. And so I think, that's, the primary area where we need to focus on is granting the appropriate authorities so that these technologies can be fully tested, developed, and deployed.
And I would further point out, thank you for making the point, is that even if we still need to better understand these, what we call the unintentional consequence, right? When we change the law or come out with a new regulations, is actually a lot of time it's the T&E, the test and evaluation, that would help us make informed decisions. For example, if we say, oh no jamming because it's going to affect people who wear pacemakers, etc. Well, we need actual data to tell us, when somebody say that I have a precise the technology that could just jam that one drone, it doesn't do anything to anything else. We need the data to tell us what is the bleeding. Is it plus or minus 1 mile around the drone, or is it plus or minus 10 miles around the drone? We need actual data. And for example, when somebody turn on the jammer, how long? If you only turn the jammer on for 5 seconds, does it actually affect the people wearing pacemaker or not? We don't know. We don't have data. So in those cases, really T&E need to be permitted in order to help policymakers make informed decisions.
So there's it's been referenced a few times. There's this White House proposal out there, legislative proposal to grant additional authority to law enforcement. We do have copies. There should still be some copies in the back of both the legislative text as well as an FAQ on it. Brenda, maybe you can help kind of level set for the audience what's in the proposal, so we can kind of delve into some of these details. And maybe you can. I think we've already started to address the motivation for it, but kind of walk us through what this proposal would do and what it wouldn't do.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So let me do two things. We talked about the threat. That's certainly a motivating factor for seeking legislative relief. But why do we need legislation to enable these activities? And that's because right now the use of effective tools to defend against this new and growing threat is hamstrung by a variety of federal laws that were passed when the only time you saw a drone was when you watched the Jetsons on TV. But now those same laws, enacted long before the advent of advanced UAS technology, present serious obstacles to the employment of these technologies. So that's really why we're seeking legislative relief. To make a long story short, these legal issues create a great uncertainty with respect to the employment of these technologies, and we think legislative relief is necessary to provide operators with the certainty they deserve to execute their responsibilities. So that lays the backdrop in terms of why we actually need legislative relief and why we can't do it right now. To briefly explain the legislation, let me summarize it with 3 points. I think the legislation does 3 things. One is it provides a tailored grant of authority to DHS and DOJ to protect certain sensitive federal facilities and assets. It limits both what DOJ and DHS can protect and who can do the protecting on the ground. So in terms of what we can protect, it only applies to, quote, covered facilities and assets, itself a term of art that refers in general to 3 core missions of DHS, 3 core missions of DOJ, and 3 core missions shared in essence between our 2 departments. We have not asked the Congress to allow us to protect all of our activities or even all of our facilities. And that's quite important. Nor have we asked for a blank check. The authority places in extremely sophisticated and substantive constraints on the use of this authority. The first paragraph of the legislation makes clear you can only use this authority when, quote, necessary to mitigate a threat posed by a drone to the safety and security of one of those sensitive, critical federal facilities and assets. And that proviso is extremely important. The second thing the proposal attempts to do at every level is to protect privacy and civil liberties. And it does that in a number of ways, including you can only take actions when necessary to mitigate the threat. That is actually a significant privacy constraint on the front end in terms of any of your operations. On the back end, subsection F, to get a little legally geeky, talks about all the privacy constraints that span the full operational life cycle, from acquisition all the way to retention to dissemination. And these constraints ensure that any sort of data that's obtained through the use of these authorities in and around those sensitive facilities is handled in a way that obviously respects constitutional rights and personal privacy and civil liberties, including the proposal actually requires the deletion of data obtained on the front end within 6 months unless a specific exception applies. And the third thing that this bill does is provide appropriate mechanisms for oversight and measures to minimize any impacts to the safety and efficiency of the National Airspace System, as well as the use of the radio frequency spectrum. It does that in a number of ways. Again, to summarize, this bill provides for semi-annual briefings to the Congress every 6 months on the use of this authority and the ways in which it attempts to protect privacy. It also contains a sunset clause. It expires in 5 years. Beyond that, it has appropriate mechanisms for oversight within the executive branch. The subsection requires the issuance of guidance or regulation within the executive branch under the supervision of our department heads that ensures this authority is used in a rigorous and responsible manner. And finally, it requires deep coordination with FAA at all levels. There is, in fact, a provision in the bill that requires us to coordinate with the Secretary of Transportation with respect to any activity that, quote, might affect aviation safety or the use of airspace. And might means might, having any tendency to impact the airspace. If that applies, we do have to work with DOT and FAA on the ground, and we think that's quite important, and certainly our partners from DOT and FAA feel the same way. So that, I think, illustrates what the legislation attempts to do.
Thank you. And Abe, let me bring you in on this. I mean, when you're obviously in the midst of this right now, looking at current threats and what DHS can do, and you're looking at this new capability. How would that affect the DHS's mission? How do you feel this would allow you to address emerging threats?
So again, I'd like to point out that DHS ultimate goal is to expedite the integration of UAS into the national airspace safely, securely, and reliably. So safely, that's under the purview of FAA, and that's about dealing with what we call unintentional mishaps, right? And then security is of high interest to all the agencies who are on the law enforcement side, who's charged with protecting people and critical infrastructure in our homeland. And that's not just DHS, but DOD, DOJ, DOE, etc., and then the state and local, etc., as well. So when we say that we want, and we are on the same page, we want, like I repeat, expedite integration of drones into the national airspace. But in order to do that, we have to assure the public that the government has the necessary tools and authority to deal with the errant and the malicious ones, to protect public safety, for one thing, as well as national security. So, in essence, countering UAS is an enabler for enabling the drones, commercial, for commerce or for leisure in our national airspace. So, going forward, our nation certainly is marching, and we want to march as fast as we can. We want to reach that full integration of drone into our national airspace, because we all understand that it will positively impact our economy. We do want to reap the benefit of drone technology, of this new exciting sector in our economy. So we want to expedite that. And so having this authority that we're seeking is an important step to enable the government to assure the public that we as a government do have the capabilities that we need and the authority that we need to deal with the nefarious and the bad ones, so that we could expedite the integration.
Thank you. Diana, how does industry see it? Because it seems like there's definitely this chicken or egg problem right now where you can't really develop the market for counter UAS technology until you have buyers, and you're not going to have buyers if the buyers don't have authority. And so you get in this kind of very stagnant market, and you're not seeing that rapid development, which in most industries that aren't heavily regulated, you would. I mean, you would see that kind of immediately come out, because there wouldn't be those types of barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. We have seen development, but we've also seen development abroad of some of these technologies and testing of these technologies abroad. There was a DHS market survey done late last year on, the breadth of counter-UAS solutions, and there's a lot, as Anne mentioned, in terms of, nets, jammers, things like that. Most of those are obviously highly regulated from an FCC perspective, Title 18. If you're getting into UTM systems, you've got issues of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and various other pieces of legislation. So it's a huge challenge, just like it has been for the drone industry itself. Counter-UAS is facing its own challenges in terms of proving out the technology and, actually being able to roll it out and deploy it.
Lisa, similar question to you. I mean, just kind of thinking about the proposal, how do you see that impacting commercial drone operations?
Yeah, so, I want to first start by praising the administration for the work that went on over the last year on this proposal. I know about a year ago, there was a different proposal that had been floated, which was much broader, that was federal government-wide, would have enabled all agencies and agents, and it was just a whole lot broader in a way that was a bit worrisome for the community. The commercial drone industry, to be clear, we see this as a pro-innovation step forward in order to enable these authorities, but of course the devil is in the details, and we want to make sure that we're protecting authorized commercial drone flights. Some feedback that our members have on the proposal itself is, right now as drafted, there's no reasonableness requirement on the nature of the threat. That's something that I think our members would feel a lot better. There doesn't have to be any justification necessary. There could be a reasonable time and location, like within, a mile or so of where the threat takes place, of the protected area, and a time requirement, for example, a notice requirement. I believe it's as I read it, said that you could warn an operator but didn't have to. I think from a commercial drone perspective, it would be very, our members would like to be warned if they're about to be shot down, so that they can remedy any accidents or, accidentally flying where they shouldn't be. There should be a requirement that agencies use reasonable care not to interfere with non-targeted manned or unmanned aircraft communications equipment facilities. Anne, I think, mentioned the, if there's someone wearing like a heart rate monitor or something. What is the, we want to understand how this technology is going to affect other things and people and vehicles in the ecosystem. Again, we see a big piece of this as remote identification. I think it'd be helpful if this required remote identification so that we know who are able to identify authorized drone flyers and operators, in addition to, as opposed to criminals. And of course, our members are very focused on protection of proprietary data. So a lot of vehicles are flown, for example, on cell phones, and how do you ensure that that data unrelated to the operation of the aircraft is protected? So that's, some of the feedback. We have more, but...
I think, it's very clear the administration put a lot of thought into this, and quite a lot of privacy protections have come through, and that's evident. One of the things that we're thinking about is, long-term unmanned traffic management systems, and not only the role that they play in actually assisting law enforcement in doing their duties, but also, just working hand in hand with the administration and other agencies that are engaged in this effort to make sure that when counter-UAS activities are engaged in UTM systems, that we don't have technological issues that actually create safety concerns across the network. So that's an area where, we would like to work hand in hand with FAA, DOT, FCC, DHS, and all the other agencies, just to make sure that as we're building out these systems today, they're future-proof and they make sense, and we're not going to cause any unintended issues.
Can I ask you to, I'd like to actually extend on 2 points, and this will be open to the whole panel, and I want to come back to some of the criticisms of the bill, but I want to make sure we level set really well for everyone. First, I don't think we've clearly defined exactly what counter-UAS measures might entail. So I'd like us to spend a little bit more on that. Is it just, shooting the drone down, or are we talking about a few other things? So let's start there, and then I want to get into the UTM systems a little bit more.
when we say countermeasure, it, again, depending on the definition, but for us, it's the entire. So the first step, of course, is being able to detect a drone, and then tracking it. Because, detect meaning that you find it's somewhere, it's located somewhere, a geolocation, but then we have to be able to track it as it moves. And then from tracking, we have to be able to identify, first of all, is it really a bird, or is it a drone, is it a bird? False alarms goes into that, and that has a lot of implication on technology, what counter U.S. technology you use for that part, detect, track, and identification. Now, when we talk about opening up the airspace for leisure as well as business drones, then there's an additional step, a huge step and a huge challenge from a law enforcement standpoint, because now they face with a huge volume of drone traffic up there that 99% of them will be legitimate. But then how do law enforcement quickly decipher friend from foes and quickly zero in the 1 or 2 or 3 bad ones, or the questionable ones or unknown ones, and leave the rest alone, the rest of the legitimate traffic alone, so that they could go about doing their business? So that's a huge step that requires not just policy, not just remote ID, but also quick technologies to help the law enforcement agent, because we're only talking about a very short time from detection all the way to mitigation. And then let's say it's determined that this drone is malicious, then that's when we talk about mitigation. And mitigation doesn't necessarily mean shooting it down. There are different countermeasures, technologies out there, ranging from just taking over the command and control of the drone and tell it to go somewhere else rather than what it's intended to do, tell it to land, or all the way up to, using nets to capture the drone, not necessarily, shooting it with a gun or anything. But yes, if you look at the market, solutions that are available on the market, they range all the way from what we call non-lethal to so-called kinetic or lethal, which is when a drone is actually shot down. To be honest, in the homeland security settings, I would doubt that we would see a lot of those so-called kinetic, where actually a drone is shot down, especially over people, right, of a public event like Independence Parade or anything like that. So, and because it's law enforcement, it's not just about dealing with the drone. And I like to make that point, is that when we fight outside of the United States, if you're in Syria, you're in Afghanistan or whatever, any drone that's not ours is a bad drone. Simple, right? And therefore, we deal with it accordingly. We shoot it down, we destroy it, etc. For Homeland Security, when you see a drone, like I said, 99% it might be legitimate. So not beyond defining friends versus foe. As law enforcement, we need to get hold of the ground controller as well. So it's not just about dealing with the drone, but also with the ground controller, which requires more or different technology, and I like to point that out as well. So when we say mitigation or countermeasure, it's yes, dealing with the bird as well as the ground controller or whoever that's, piloting that drone.
Any other comments on that? All right, well then I want to go to the UTM systems, and maybe Diana, you can start with that since you've mentioned it a few times. That's just something that is still a goal in drone technology. How do you see, first can you kind of explain it
Sure.
To everyone,
Sure.
the goal, and then and kind of where we are along that process, but also how you see that integrating with these questions about threats and risk and control.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So unmanned traffic management, or UTM, is really a concept that was born out of NASA years ago. And the idea is, as we start to incorporate different types of vehicles into integrated airspace, we need to create an infrastructure in place similar to what we have to manage roadways today. So you think of the way you drive on the roads, you have to have a license, you have speed limits, you have stop signs, you have right-of-ways. That's the type of sort of, core infrastructure that we need in airspace to have manned, unmanned, urban air mobility vehicles, all integrating very safely. That research has been conducted by NASA for years now in partnership with many industry partners, including our company and about 200 others that have been testing out different components of what we call UTM. Many of these components are actually already commercially available today. So while we don't see an actual full UTM deployment in the airspace yet today, we do have quite a few components. Lance is actually one of them that the FAA has rolled out with industry partners over the last year, requiring the automatic notification or authorization to access controlled airspace. Remote ID and tracking is going to be the next piece of it. Long term, it's really, true traffic management the way that controllers do it today, but through actual systems. And, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is really the core technology that we need in place to actually have a secure airspace across the United States, because as a law enforcement entity, when you're doing your job, you usually don't have a lot of time to react, right? So if you see a drone there, you need to understand, is this a good drone? Is this a bad drone? If it's a bad drone, is it just careless, or is it potentially terrorism? Because you're going to do different things. And just to have that data available to you in a seamless manner to understand what's going on in the airspace around you, is what we need to move forward here. And eventually it's probably not going to be nets or guns or things like that. It's something like accessing an app through your mobile device and being able to go back to a command center and get information about that drone and actually, reroute it through a button on your cell phone.
Right. I want to come back now to, Lisa, you raised a number of critiques from industry of the proposal. Brendan, I'd like to give you a chance to kind of lay out some of the responses to those, and then we can maybe have a little bit of a dialogue on some of these, as well as some of the other concerns that have been raised. So maybe if you can start on the reasonableness of the threat, and talk about how the bill defines that, and obviously we have to preface this with, this is obviously a proposal. Congress will ultimately be responsible, so things might change, but just in terms of how you guys have been thinking about it through the process that you've worked through.
Sure, thank you. Well, let me just start by saying that we welcome a dialogue on the proposal. We welcome a dialogue in general on these activities, and as Lisa mentioned, we've been engaged in an ongoing discussion for years now on how best to do this, how to get it right for the government, how to get it right for private sector stakeholders as well. So this is of paramount importance to the administration, because this administration has spent a great deal of time and energy advancing the state of the art and promoting the industry with the integration pilot program and other activities. And to be sure, that same commitment to protecting and promoting the industry applies to this activity as well. So with that introductory comment out of the way, to get to the actual substance of Lisa's point with respect to reasonableness, it's correct. The bill does not say reasonableness, and that's because it sets a much higher bar, and that is that any activity has to be necessary to mitigate. In general, when Congress authorizes DOJ or DHS to take a law enforcement action, it uses words like reasonable. Take actions reasonably necessary or reasonable in light of the threat. We've actually adopted a higher threshold in this case. Congress adopted that same threshold to the Department of Defense in their grant of counter-UAS authority in the fiscal year 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. So we actually do not favor reasonableness, because we are, in fact, holding ourselves to a higher standard, which is it must be necessary. It's not good enough that the threat is reasonable. It must be necessary to take action in that particular circumstance.
Lisa, any reactions?
Well, I guess one question there would be necessary to mitigate a threat, but what is the definition of that threat?
Sure, and that's another great point too. So in this bill, for purposes of this bill, threat is not defined in the eye of the beholder. The first paragraph of legislation actually requires both the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to define threat in consultation with the Secretary of Transportation. That's quite important. So it's actually not just up to law enforcement operators on the ground to decide for themselves what a threat means. This is actually quite unusual. Legislation rarely requires the government to spell out threat, and that's done in order to preserve operational flexibility. But here, realizing what's at stake in an effort to ensure this is done in a thoughtful and measured way, we've actually proposed requiring ourselves to spell out in advance the conditions that constitute a threat. That's yet another protection in place on the use of this authority, which is, again, very rare in terms of legislation. You just don't see that. But we think it's important and it's appropriate in this context. So that would, again, be a very rich conversation with FAA. That would be part of the regulations and guidance that apply to the use of these activities. What exactly is a threat?
And again, we also very much thank you for being even here at this event today and the continued conversations around this. On the guidance that's going to be developed, we would urge that industry as well, in addition to FAA, DOT, other relevant agencies, have a seat at the table. The legislation calls for the development of guidance, but it does not require any outreach to the public or to industry, and we would very much like to have input into the development of that guidance.
Let's talk about the notice requirements. I thought that was a really interesting point. I mean, is this going to be a shoot first, ask questions later kind of drone bill, or how are you thinking about that issue? Because obviously as has been mentioned, I mean, there's a timeliness issue, I think, that comes into play when you're dealing with a drone threat, where there is urgency in many of these situations.
Yes, yeah. Well, let me start by saying, the Department of Justice is not in the business of destroying evidence. So as An mentioned, you're not going to see what's been referred to as the Remington solution being applied. There won't be. That's just not realistic in the homeland, and there's no intent to engage in that activity. And I think our colleagues at DOT and FAA would have serious qualms about that as well. So Belisa obviously makes a great point about warning. This is something we've thought about a lot. The bill authorizes a range of activities that operators can take. They range from detection all the way up to disruption, if, again, necessary to mitigate a threat. One of those activities doesn't, of course, involve warning, which would depend essentially on the circumstances. All of these activities conducted under this proposal must comply with the Constitution. That includes the Fourth Amendment, which means these activities must be constitutionally reasonable. There are some circumstances where it might not be constitutionally reasonable to take any sort of kinetic, decisive action unless you actually warn the operator in advance or attempted to do so. So that's actually baked into our constitutional fabric, that proposal, and that's why the legislation authorizes warning. Now, to be sure, it does not require warning in every instance, because there will be circumstances in which it's just not feasible to deliver warning under in particular scenarios. So in that situation, it does not make sense to tie the operator's hands and require him or her to provide warning where it's just where you're not capable of doing that. But trying to ensure that we give appropriate warning to operators is of foremost importance to both DHS and DOJ. And I should say, too, another component of warning is baked into the FAA's procedures. So again, this bill requires us, before we actually use this authority in a particular place, to conduct a risk-based assessment. Now, we haven't mentioned this, but the Attorney General and the Secretary of DHS cannot simply activate this capability and then have it used a minute later. They are required to undergo a risk-based assessment. This is in the statute. It's in subsection L, with our colleagues at FAA, which could include a variety of other stakeholders, including the Federal Communications Commission and the NTIA. And now, in part and parcel with that process, that risk-based assessment involves providing notice to airmen in the area and telling them that this particular facility may be protected with counter-UAS measures. So providing notice to airmen is one component of warning that's already built into this proposal. It's something we take very seriously and are committed to doing in partnership with our colleagues at DOT.
Okay. And a couple more issues I want to bring up. At Lisa mentioned one, the proprietary data protection. I mean, this gets to obviously a lot of the privacy questions that have been raised in general, especially when we start talking about accessing data, interfering with communications. How are you thinking about protections for that population, or for that concern?
Yes, yeah. So this is another excellent point that Lisa brings up. We're well aware that 3 to 5 years from now, there will, we hope, be fleets of drones conducting important services across the country, and we want to operate seamlessly with those drones and avoid getting in their way, just like we know they'll avoid getting in our way. So this bill incorporates a number of protections designed to protect commercial proprietary data and to ensure that our activities are narrowly scoped. So on the front end of the bill, as I mentioned earlier, any sort of activity that we take must be, quote, necessary to mitigate the threat. It's not necessary to access commercial proprietary data to mitigate the threat. It might be necessary to determine where the drone is going through either counter-UAS detection systems or a combination of remote ID and those detection systems. But it's not necessary to get stored data on the phone or stored data on the drone. On the back end in subsection F, the proposal contains additional constraints. You can only obtain communications to or from a drone, which could involve commercial proprietary data. It really depends what you're doing. You can only do that to the extent necessary to support a function of DHS or DOJ. An additional constraint, it's not going to be necessary to get commercial proprietary data there. That would run afoul of the statute and be a reportable incident under the scheme. Moreover, even if any such data were acquired, it would have to be deleted within 6 months. So we have tried to account for that within the fabric of the bill because we certainly have no interest in that data. And we want to ensure that, again, this is done in a thoughtful way on the ground where it's actually employed.
So we very much appreciate the privacy protection, that it gets much more, attention than it did. One thing that we would point out would be that the privacy protections in F apply to the regulations prescribed or guidance issued under the legislation, but not the actual actions taken. So we would like to see that broadened to include the actual actions as well.
Diana, did you have thoughts?
So, there's also an argument to be made that sometimes as a commercial entity, you actually may want to voluntarily opt to provide additional data in order to gain certain benefits in terms of operating in controlled airspace. And so, I see a scenario where there's a base level of requirement of what you'd have to provide in remote ID and tracking. But companies like ours may actually want to provide additional information to make sure that we're not accidentally deemed a threat and that we're actually operating legitimately and seamlessly without any interruptions in more sensitive airspaces.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment about it, and thank you for bringing it up. Because from a DHS standpoint, I would point to the fact that DHS has been operating under that model. When we deal with cargoes, think of the millions of cargoes or the millions of travelers going through U.S. ports today. So we, CBP, TSA, we do not have resources to scrutinize every single traveler or every single container. So we have minimum requirements like we just talked about here, but then we also have voluntary submission of data in addition to the minimum. So we're talking about mandatory, which is what remote ID tracking, blah, 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 will be dictating, by FAA. But then down the road, DHS certainly would be interested in voluntary information, additional to the mandatory. So, for example, we have trusted cargo, that's CTPAT, and they have different levels. So let's say a shipping company like Costco, they might voluntarily submit more data to CBP than what's minimum required, because then the more we know about you, we meaning law enforcement, the more we could leave you alone. Right? And because, again, law enforcement only need and want to focus on the unknown at first. So if I'm a company shipping things from Afghanistan and I don't provide you with anything, of course, that I would make myself a primary target for flagging, for being scrutinized, inspected, etc. But if I'm a Costco, every week I send the same container through the port, I'm coming from England, etc., then I certainly want for CBP to know that that's the case, so that they would leave me alone. So we try to provide incentives, because then CTPAT 3, which is the maximum level, those companies don't get flagged for only for spot check. Of course, we always spot check, but in general, CTPAT 3 companies, for example, don't get flagged for further scrutiny through the ports, like I said, except for spot checking. So same thing with, think about travelers, the pre-check, the TSA pre-check lines, right? Those are what we call trusted travelers, right? That's why we could go through the checkpoint without taking our jacket or taking our computer outside, because those people voluntarily give the government more information about themselves ahead of the time when they show up at the airport. So again, all of that is not mandatory, but because the person or the cargo, or in future the drone operators or the company operating the drones voluntarily give the government or law enforcement more information about their whereabouts, their operations, whatever, then it's easier for law enforcement to, try to designate them as trusted drones, so then we could leave them alone. So that works for the company. It works for law enforcement as well, because as you already know, we do not have resources to scrutinize everything up there. We won't be able to if we want to sort through that drone traffic quickly and efficiently and accurately. Again, we want to reduce the size of the haystack in order to better find the needles. So it works both ways. We love to get more information from the private sector, from industry, from drone owners, and we love to provide incentives for you to do that, so that it works for you and works for us.
Yeah, and we think that's a great idea. Thank you. We actually did propose something like a trusted operator-like system as part of the Remote ID ARC report, and it is in the report. We think that, I know our member companies will more, generally want to give more information rather than less. And so, anything that we can do to help you in that, please let us know.
So I want to raise, we have a fantastic panel here today. No one necessarily up here representing civil liberties. So I want to raise a couple civil rights and civil liberties questions, because I think one critique that's often raised is that government and industry might get together and decide on something that's great for them, and maybe you're leaving out the interest of hobbyists or recreational users or news organizations, some of these other groups. So the particular concerns that have typically been raised in this regard. So the first one would be around First Amendment rights. So especially the right to photography and how this. So I'd like you to maybe Brendan and maybe you can talk about how specifically this proposal might impact some of those rights and how you're thinking about those users as well.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. So this is another important issue that we think about a lot in designing this authority and would think about, of course, in executing this authority. So. As a bedrock matter, the Constitution applies to everything we do. That's no different here. We would be required to comply with the Constitution in every respect in every move we made under this proposal. And the First Amendment is always top of mind. So there are a couple of things to note on that. The first issue is that, again, any site subject to counter-U.S. authorities would be subject to appropriate notice to airmen as well. So those in the immediate area, and certainly those with a remote pilot license or those with any access to the internet, would know where these sites are located within the Department of Justice and DHS. And FAA would provide appropriate airspace notification to those in the immediate area. And even though, and this is another important point, speaking of First Amendment rights and the right to take photography and to even report on the news, a number of news gathering organizations are doing important work with drones right now. We want to facilitate, not impede, that activity. Even when a given area is subject to airspace restrictions, the FAA does consider and evaluate requests to permit access to that otherwise restricted airspace when in the public interest. And again, I defer to my colleagues DOT and FAA on the dynamics and specifics of that, but these are not exactly categorical exclusions to activities within those protected areas. So that's yet another way that this proposal would facilitate potentially access to those areas, again in the discretion of DOT and FAA, which owns the airspace, not DOJ or DHS. In terms of the proposal, the actual activities, again, this is something we've attempted to bake in at every level of the proposal. On the front end, we beat the necessary to mitigate drum enough, but again, it's not necessary to mitigate a threat if you're conducting First Amendment protected activities, point blank. So if you are in fact conducting First Amendment protected activities, there's not a threat. If you're in accessible airspace, you're not a threat. This proposal doesn't deal with you. We're not talking about you. We're not worried about you. And again, that's another reason why we're thinking about that. On the back end, if this proposal does involve those activities, there are all kinds of constraints, mainly in subsection F, where we would have to delete data. Again, we can't disseminate that data outside of the department before it's deleted, and the like. So there are sort of a multi-layered protective mechanisms in the bill to protect liberties such as the First Amendment.
So let's talk about the kind of logistics of the legislation. What kind of prospects are out there right now for it? It's been circulating for a while. What have you been hearing? What is the industry thinking? How is your engagement on this issue? I'll just open it up to whoever wants to take that first.
I may or may not have just come from the Hill this morning, straight here, and barely made it through a lunch. And of course, this was one of the timely topics with the House bill coming to the floor next week. We've been very clear, and many industry associations have been very clear that we've been close partners with the FAA and DOT on ensuring a safe airspace, and we want to be as equally close partners with the security agencies to ensure a secure airspace as well. I think, I would be very surprised if we didn't see something very soon, but possibly coming out of the House Homeland Security office or committee that looks, either the same or very similar to the administration's proposal. Around the time when the administration proposal came out, we did see a similar bill come from Hartzler's office. One thing that I liked in that bill that was missing from the administration proposal was really the tie-in between remote identification and tracking and the counter-UAS. And as Lisa mentioned, we really think the two go hand in hand together, and we'd love to see, to see remote ID mentioned in the actual bill that moves forward in whatever vehicle.
Lisa?
Well, I would also just add to that, on the remote ID piece, of course, FAA reauthorization is happening now. So, we expect to see amendments. There's Section 336 of the 2012 Modernization and Reform Act currently does not allow the FAA to actually regulate model aircraft. So to the extent that we want to require model aircraft to have remote ID, that section needs to either be repealed or amended. There's a lot of efforts afoot right now looking at that, and I expect we'll see something in the FAA reauthorization to that effect. Still kind of TBD.
And can I ask, on the conversation about remote identification, I think there's, again, kind of maybe on some of the civil liberty sides, there are arguments for recreational drone users being able to basically to fly anonymously. That interferes with the ability to track and identify threats. How are those conflicting goals being addressed in the conversations you're hearing on the Hill?
I don't think it's this huge dichotomy of either sharing everything or sharing nothing. It's just like cars on the road today. Everyone in the public sees the license plate, right? But the law enforcement agencies can access more data about you if there's an issue that goes wrong. So no one's suggesting that everyone in the public should be able to access remote ID systems and be able to understand what you're doing in your own backyard, or be able to track competitive companies' package delivery versus your own, and things like that. Sensitive proprietary information is not getting to the hands of competitors or the general public here, so I think this legislation strikes the right balance in that respect.
And I would just add, this is not meant to be overly burdensome on hobbyists, right? It should be cheap and easy to comply. Otherwise, we're not going to see compliance. So the idea is just figuring out what that balance looks like. Hobbyists have been flying in the national airspace safely for decades, and that hasn't changed. But what has changed is the national airspace, right? So they're now the commercial drone industry is now also sharing the airspace with many others as well. So, times have changed, technologies move forward. So, we just need our laws to evolve as well.
And so this bill is really addressing federal authority. I think we should emphasize that. How are we thinking about state and local, responses? Maybe not in this bill, but in the future.
So we've seen, and this has been a huge challenge in our industry over the last few years. Every year, there's literally hundreds of bills seeking to regulate drones, from sometimes a safety perspective, sometimes privacy, sometimes tort law, and sometimes security. So, what we've seen out of the FAA extension a couple of years ago was the 2209 provision to designate no-fly zones over critical infrastructure. Again, great measure that, we need in place to ensure no accidents are actually happening. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the past couple of years is many states trying to regulate this area, and the challenge with that is they tend to take different definitions of what's critical infrastructure. There's no centralized system. There's no reporting back to the FAA. So as a company trying to operate our business across, all the states in the United States, it's impossible to keep track of, what's critical infrastructure in this county versus that county, and what we really want to see. And I think, the petroleum and chemical industries that have, advocated for these measures alongside with industry, what we'd like to see is this unified framework, which is coming together currently under the 2209 process. The best way to keep safety and security in our airspace is to have one set of rules.
And Dan, if I could build on that. So in terms of counter-UAS activities, the federal government is not the only interested party, by a long shot. Even, in fact, within the federal government, DOJ and DHS are not the only parties with interest. The Department of the Interior has a significant problem with interruptions to wildfire suppression efforts caused by errant drone operations. So that stops wildfire suppression activities on a routine basis. DOI would not be covered under this proposal, only DHS and DOJ. So there are other legitimate federal interests that are not accounted for under this proposal, because the thought was to proceed in a phased approach, to prove to the Congress and the American public that this authority would be used in a rigorous and responsible manner to protect core missions and assets, but in the hopes of eventually expanding from that premise to include additional activities that are important to protect. But that's just within the federal government. Private critical infrastructure owners are in regular conversation with us, expressing serious misgivings about the drone threat to their own activities, and this includes private companies, it includes sports stadium owners and operators, those in the petrochemical business. We've heard from major amusement parks. They are all facing this problem with one hand tied behind their backs, just like state, local, and federal law enforcement are. So the antidote to that problem is legislative relief. That's the issue, that Congress holds the keys to solving this issue, and enabling legitimate actors to defend their own equities in a way that's thoughtful and minimizes impacts to the airspace. What you don't want is to have disparate approaches all across the country that do not account for privacy and do not account for the safety and efficiency of the NASH. We have no interest in that, and I don't think our partners in the commercial drone industry have any interest in that at all either. So that's a concern that we could have unless we get congressional action to release these constraints in a thoughtful way and allow us to do something rather than nothing.
So just kind of looking forward, and I have a couple more questions, and I want to open it up to the audience for questions. Is there anything this proposal doesn't do? We've talked about ID and tracking. We've talked about, obviously, some of the state and local. Is there anything else in this proposal that maybe we're not going to be doing right now, but if we had a 5-year plan for legislation, what's the next thing we're going to be really focused on?
Sure. I think there are kind of 3 categories there. One is there are many activities of Department of Justice and Department of Homeland that are not included here.
Right.
And just to give one small example, the bill authorizes us to protect Bureau of Prisons activities or Bureau of Prisons facilities that are, quote, high risk or assessed to be a threat. Now, that does not necessarily include all 122 federal prisons, even though we think there's a legitimate security need now to protect those prisons. Again, we're asking for a phased approach. We haven't asked for everything, and the same applies with some of DHS's missions. There are other activities where it might be useful to do. The second is with respect to other federal government agencies like the Department of the Interior. And the third would be appropriate legislative relief and authorization for either state and local operators and or private critical infrastructure owners at the right time under the right conditions.
I want to come back to, finally, the issue of competitiveness, which is kind of where we started. As we're kind of looking at this legislation, one, how would this change, U.S. competitiveness in both commercial drone usage as well as counter UAS technology, and how should we be thinking about these competitiveness issues as we move forward on this bill?
I think on both fronts, it helps advance things for the United States. One, in terms of allowing us to develop and test these technologies and be competitive in, state-of-the-art counter-UAS measures, but also on the broader commercial drone industry side, there's been an informal, hold on future regulations to fly over people beyond line of sight, to do things like package delivery. In order to get there and do all these great things that are going to help the economy and competitiveness, we need to solve the security issue. That's why we're, here today talking about this, and why we've been, close partners with DHS and many other agencies to try to move this forward.
Lisa, any other thoughts?
No, I would agree with that 100%. I mean, I think we talked earlier about the issues around research and development here in the United States, and not being able to conduct that research and development under current law. And obviously, that's a challenge in the UAS use space as well, of needing waivers or exemptions to even do research and development around expanded operations. So, the technology has really moved forward, and the policies have lagged behind. I hope that this, can help kind of jumpstart the expanded operations rules. Right now, everything is, you can't do that unless you get special approvals from the FAA in terms of expanded operations. And the goal is to get to, yes, you can do that unless, like broadly authorize these same activities in order to grow the industry and grow the commercial drone space.
Okay, so I want to open up to questions again. Anyone that's watching online, we are using the hashtag ITIF drones. ITIF drones, just use that and we'll get to your questions. I think we have someone in the room and we have a mic, so just raise your hand, and we're going to be doing identification in this room. So.
Carl Zabo with NetChoice. So there is, and Brendan, you mentioned this existing law that was reapproved by Congress just a couple of months ago regarding military management of drones near nuclear, our nuclear defense program, weapons testing facilities. So to suggest that there have been no laws to keep up with the pace of drones, I don't think is entirely accurate. But one of the big changes that this does do is, rather than having fixed infrastructure where you know whether it is authorized or unauthorized for entrance, this enables basically the ability to go with any law enforcement or any homeland security. So it's almost like a traveling barrier, where one of the requirements is just, if it's an active investigation, is enough to give you the authority to take action. That aside, two questions. One, getting to the privacy, we had an analogy to license plates. Should there be an inclusion of something like the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, which regulates the ability of law enforcement to get access to license plate information? And then the second is, and Brendan, you mentioned the idea of drones interfering with Department of Interior putting out forest fires. Are you of the opinion, or is the DOJ of the opinion, that today you don't have the authority to stop a drone that's interfering with first responders or law enforcement?
Sure. So thanks very much for the questions. I think they're good ones. To take the last one first. So we're of the opinion right now that there is substantial legal doubt surrounding the use of tools to detect and mitigate malicious uses of drones, or errant uses of drones, for that matter. Are there certain things you could potentially do? Sure, there may be, but they involve unacceptably high levels of legal risk. And because of that, counsel are disinclined to allow their clients, the operators in the field, to engage in these activities, because it places them in potential legal jeopardy. And many of the provisions we're talking about, just to show you why there's concern, involve not just civil liability, but criminal liability. These are criminal provisions, and we're not in the business of violating the same laws that we swear to uphold. So that explains the backdrop. So yes, there are serious constraints about even interfering or detecting much much less mitigating even drones interfering with federal wildfires today. That's a fact. The second issue you brought up was that this proposal allows, in the shared mission sets, to protect the scenes of active federal law enforcement investigation. This is a good point. I think it's worth discussing here. So we have seen on many occasions our criminals and other actors use drones to harass and surveil law enforcement, federal law enforcement, at the scene of investigation. So this is not a hypothetical threat. It has happened in the past. It will happen in the future. We have limited means of dealing with this threat due to those legal barriers right now. The bill allows us to protect those, but To do that, you would have to have the Attorney General of the United States or the Secretary of Homeland Security identify that federal law enforcement investigation in consultation with the Secretary of Transportation and perform a risk-based assessment, which would take into account the particulars of the technological tools being deployed to detect and disrupt drones, as well as the circumstances of the area. So the whether it's an urban environment, whether it's a rural environment, the use of the radio frequency spectrum in the area. So a detailed analysis. So it's not as though you can simply this capability resides in a magical backpack, and FBI agents will be able to detect drones everywhere they go. You can't do that. This sets up an architecture to ensure that it's carefully controlled. So it's not true to say that we could immediately protect the scenes of federal law enforcement investigations all over the United States. It has to be done in a measured way, again, with approval by the head of the department in consultation with DOT.
But it doesn't say how broadly that approval is granted. There can be a broad authority from the head of DOJ and DOT.
But it's a particular authority. So the risk-based assessment takes into account the actual scene, the actual scenario at hand, and the actual technology being deployed, not a generic grant of authority. So the risk-based assessment is about the specific place.
Yes.
So I've got a couple questions a little bit unrelated to each other somewhat. So Ashton Harvey, I'm here with George Mason University. So one is you discussed the engagement decision being made, but you didn't actually discuss who would be financially liable for any costs incurred because of an engagement decision, and who the burden of proof laid on after an engagement decision was made that was a valid engagement decision. Two, you didn't really describe what proper notice to airmen would be. So an individual operating a drone is not necessarily versed in checking arcane systems that we currently use to notify airmen of restricted airspace. So how do you plan to make that accessible to the people who are already flying drones in that airspace? And then three, a lot of the things that you discussed didn't just sound like the Title 18 and Title 49 reliefs that you were talking about. You discussed your data retention rights, privacy concerns, technological solutions to be able to perform non-kinetic kills and drone surveillance. A lot of that really speaks to the two departments there that are members of intelligence community agencies. It sounds a lot like Title 50 restrictions. Are you also seeking Title 50 relief in these same efforts as well?
Sure. So thanks for the questions. On the first point about civil liability, this bill does not bar any kind of otherwise appropriate civil liability. So to the extent the federal government would be liable under this proposal for an activity taken pursuant to this proposal, I should say, under, for instance, the Federal Tort Claims Act, this bill would not preclude liability. So this bill says nothing about that. So if liability is otherwise appropriate, if some activity causes an injury to property, for instance, and the federal government would be liable under the FTCA, this bill would not preclude liability. Nor would it preclude, I should say, liability against an individual federal officer, if that were otherwise appropriate. This bill does not do that. So if you're liable, if you would ordinarily be liable, you'd remain liable under this proposal. It doesn't preclude liability. The second point is about notice to airmen. I would push back on the premise that the systems FAA are using are behind the times. Before You Fly is a really easily accessible app, accessible right now on your iPhone, and that's not using 1980s technology. That's really easy to use. It's up to date. They've done a great job of publicizing that. So again, an FAA would, under this bill, provide appropriate airspace solutions, including notification, under that risk-based assessment we talked about. So it's going to be easy to find that information, and it's free. It doesn't cost anything. So again, I would just sort of push back on that premise. And the third question about Title 50, this statute does not have anything to do with Title 15. We're talking about legal concerns arising out of Title 18 statutes. The privacy protections I mentioned are actually baked into the text of this provision because we want to ensure that, again, the point of this provision is quite simply to enable appropriate protection of sensitive federal facilities and assets. We want to ensure that we're doing that, though, in a way that protects privacy and promotes the state of the industry, which we want to accelerate their progress, not impede it. So this proposal does not deal with Title 50.
Thank you. Doug Johnson with the Consumer Technology Association. Obviously the bill was written with drones in mind, but to the concept of urban air mobility and the errant air taxi, what happens to that rider? And I can't imagine all these options would be exercised, but did you have that in mind? Because it's possible in the next 5 years, the term of this legislation, that you might have this in a couple of different places.
No, it's a great question. I was in an all-day meeting yesterday on urban air mobility, and yeah.
I mean, I think so. I would love to take a taxi across DC with wings instead of wheels, and so we would celebrate that. And I think that would be up to the FAA and DOT, though, if they categorize that as a UAS, or is that in another category, for instance. And but obviously, we would want to do this in a way that protects that industry as well, that emerging technology. But it's a great point. But again, we'd welcome that development, and we certainly don't want to stand in the way.
Got a question over here.
Hey, Matt Leonard with Government Computer News. A couple quick questions. With the UTMs, what is needed to take it from the LANCs that Skyward, Project Wing, and AirMap are working on to the remote ID technology that you guys are talking about? What has to happen to take that next step? And two, it sounds like you guys said there are a couple options as far as the technologies to intervene with these drones, but who's taking the lead to actually decide which one of these technologies are going to be used if this legislation actually passes?
So I'll respond to the first question in terms of, where do we get from the airspace information that we're providing today through apps to actual remote ID and possibly tracking. As Lisa mentioned, late last year, many of us participated in the FAA Aviation Rulemaking Committee on remote ID and tracking. And AUVSI actually did some of the legwork up front and asked members of the industry in the United States and abroad to actually submit their concepts for remote ID solutions. And there were over 50 different solutions that were put forward. These technologies are already available today. They're ready to be rolled out. One of the things, what's the only things holding it back is that we actually don't have a rule mandating remote ID and tracking yet. So while they're available, nobody is motivated to use them because it's not a requirement. I think we're likely to see a remote ID and tracking rule come out very soon, and that will change. It's not a technological challenge. We're already there.
From the counter-UAS, from a DHS standpoint, for example, for the law enforcement who's in charge of protecting infrastructure or events or, national security special events, for example, we don't view UTM as the ultimate source of information for law enforcement to take action against detected drones. We use it as a source to help us decide whether a detected drone is a friend or foe. Okay, so the concept is really, let's say I'm Secret Service and my job is to protect the White House, or I'm charged with protecting the Pentagon. So each of these facilities, for example, the government, we will have our own counter-UAS capability that includes detection, tracking, etc. But where UTM comes in is when we compare our data that we collect from our sensors, from our tracking device, with what's being reported in the UTM. Again, to understand whether this is a trusted drone or not. For example, if I see a drone over there, but in the UTM it's not reported at all, it's nothing in the UTM, so that drone is not UTM compliant. So therefore, it's right away it's a questionable drone. It's an unknown drone. So of course we'll scrutinize it further. Now, the opposite would be when a drone it's complying, it does everything, it gives its remote ID, it meets all the requirements, it's giving all the information it's supposed to give. But we watch it, right? When it enters certain zone around let's say, a critical infrastructure, then that's when we might issue warning, we might say, all right, we need to scrutinize this one further. And when it gets further into an inner ring, then we have to take action no matter what. Because, again, it might be a drone who says, I'm Google, but in reality, it's not. I'm just a drone that's disguising to be a Google drone. So there are security measures that we have to take. And UTM is just a source of reference to help law enforcement, but it's not the only tool and the ultimate tool. So that's the one point. So as far as your question about how do we go from, the remote ID tracking to UTM and then beyond, I would we've been talking about a concept of USS, these third-party service providers. Just if you think about the cell phone, it would be the Verizon, the AT&T, so there might be, in the future, there will be entities who take on that and provide the service of take in the data from various drone operators and then feed various, in our case, government systems, so that we could use it as a reference. So for us, another important step is various building the interface. So NASA is working with industry to come up with a common interface. So we have to standardize the interface, and then based on that, we, the government side, will make sure that we build on our side all the necessary technology so that we could receive the data feed from a USS. There's also concepts, and I mark just concepts, about maybe having a government USS in addition to private USS, for example, to deal with data that might be more too sensitive, or nobody else but government would have the business of seeing that data. So, or to receive voluntary information, like talked about earlier, for trusted drones, for example. So that's, again, it's just a concept at this point. But again, that's another necessary step for us to get to the future of having unmanned traffic in the sky and having necessary tools for the government, for law enforcement, to deal with the bad ones.
We have maybe a minute for one more question.
I just wanted to ask Diana if you mentioned that we may see a ID and tracking regulation soon. Could you elaborate on that, and how and when would that dovetail with the legislation that the administration is proposing?
Okay, so I believe they're probably going to be separate, standalone. This is legislation going on the Hill currently. Remote ID and tracking is something that's going to come out of the FAA. The FAA indicated a couple months ago that they were close to having a rule. Now, we don't know what the vehicle was. I think there's an argument to be made that for security reasons, it may make sense to move forward with a fast implementation in terms of the rulemaking, as opposed to the lengthy public comment process, especially given that this topic has been public. Many companies have weighed in over the last couple of years as well. The ID and tracking technologies are already ready to be deployed, so we likely don't need the lengthy lead time that we would have if this was the initiation of the discussion. But it's difficult to say. Things change all the time. We thought we were getting flight over people 2 years ago, and it just disappeared. So,
yeah, there's been like Diana said, there's been a lot of talk within the FAA about whether this should be issued as an interim final rule, meaning that it wouldn't actually include a lengthy notice and comment period, given the recent activity with accidents, and whether that constitutes the emergency. There are requirements for that kind of rulemaking. We've also heard it could be an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, depending on how fully baked the proposal is. The FAA has given us some details in terms of their current proposal, but they've been pretty clear that it's just ideas for right now, and it's not any formal proposal yet. So, from the commercial drone industry perspective, we're very eager in anticipating the rule, and we can't wait to see it.
Yeah, and we have been championing this, both on the House and Senate side as well, as part of, what needs to go into a long-term reauthorization. So however we get there, sooner the better.
Homeland Security Committee, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's separate than the FAA reauthorization. Who is spearheading this, or who would spearhead it? Perhaps Brendan could enlighten us on that.
Sure. So that's up to the Congress. I won't speak for them. There's a lot of interest, both the House and the Senate, in moving this bill forward. But as far as the right way to do that and the vehicle of choice, I'll let Congress speak on that point. But suffice it to say, I think there's a lot of interest on both sides of the Congress.
Is there anybody carrying the football right now?
Again, I think just wait and see is the best answer I can give you there, but there's a lot of interest.
Thank you.
So maybe we can close with predictions, which are always fun. How much longer until we can order a burrito at night that's delivered over a crowded population?
The burrito delivery has already happened in Virginia, so over the crowded population
At night.
is another story. At night, yeah, it's probably a few years from now.
A few years, okay.
Yeah.
Brendan, are you?
That's an unfortunate reality, potentially, but we would welcome that sooner.
Yeah.
And pizza, for that matter. So no reason to stop with burrito.
Great. Okay, well, we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. Hopefully, each time we do this, I feel like we are actually moving very quickly. And so I think that's a testament both to industry and government working together on these issues. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today for this conversation.
Thanks. Nice job. You always have really good, great points. Good. Yeah.